are Vineyard.
Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
We've led over 156 first-time decisions for Jesus Christ on a Sunday morning just by drawing the line in the sand and saying, do you want to give your life to Jesus Christ today? If you do, then raise your hand right where you're sitting. And people have responded, and it's God's grace. It is just God, just like my story. And this is what gave me so much confidence. I was not looking for God. In fact, I was running in the opposite direction. But He's after us. His love and His presence is after us. He wants to rescue His children. And if we really believe that the Father is always at work and no one can come to the Lord unless the Father draws them, then all we need to do is we need to be faithful and take out that leap of faith to just draw that line in the sand and invite people to respond. Like I had never been told growing up that a decision for Jesus was actually important. And there are people in our churches all across the nation that just don't know that actually making a personal decision, that believing in their own hearts and confessing that He is Lord, that's actually like an important step. Yeah. And there's going to be 1,000 steps after that. Of course there is. But that first one is important because there are 150 to 160 eternal stories that we've gotten to be a part of by making that simple change on a Sunday morning.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. 2024 marks the 50th anniversary of Vineyard churches in the U.S., and to celebrate throughout the year, we'll be periodically sharing stories of local Vineyard churches throughout the country. In today's episode, Joel Seymour, super regional leader for Vineyard USA, talks to Jeff Faust. Jeff is the lead pastor at Vineyard Church of the Rockies in Fort Collins, Colorado. Let's listen in.
Well, man, I am with Jeff Faust today. Jeff, it is so good to be with you. We had some tacos in Grand Junction, Colorado last fall, and it was great tacos, but it was even a better conversation, very encouraging. And then I got to hear a bit of your story at the workshop that I helped host at the national conference. And so good to hear your story and how you ended up in Fort Collins, Colorado. And I just knew we wanted to talk to you and hear your story, and that folks who are listening today would be encouraged by it. So thank you, brother, for being on here.
Yeah, thankful to be here. And I think probably like half these podcasts, I've just sensed God's presence in like a real tangible way as people have told their stories, what God's doing around the nation. And so, yeah, I'm honored to be here and thankful to be talking with you.
Well, you're one of those stories, brother, and the encouragement you've gotten from the other ones, I think others are going to get from your story. And so as we talk about your story, I just, let's start where all stories begin. It's like, just tell us a little bit about yourself, whatever you'd like to share about growing up, finding Jesus, those kind of things, getting into ministry. But we'd just love to hear about your life, brother.
Yeah, sure. Well, like a lot of stories, it's just a long, windy road, right? I mean, I didn't grow up following Jesus at all. I grew up in a small town in Iowa. Family of 5. I had an older brother, a younger sister, and it was a blended family. So my mom had been married previously, and I had an older brother from her first marriage, and she met my dad, and they had me and my younger sister. So just kind of interesting family dynamics to be born into. My brother was biracial as well. And so growing up in small town Iowa in a blended family with a biracial brother, and I mean, just, a lot of interesting things that don't always play very well in small towns in the middle of the Midwest. And we just, I would say we were humanists. We were agnostic, probably. I think I grew up hoping that there may be like a supreme being out there somewhere, but no real tangible expression of Jesus or Christianity in our home. Definitely weren't seeking God as a family or individually at all. Just whatever made you happy. Whatever made you happy. And so we'd spend the money on things to try to find happiness and joy. We would go on trips to find happiness and joy. We would try to build friendships to find happiness and joy. Of course, everything just falls short. And then you layer on top of that just some of the dysfunction that is in my family. I growing up in a family probably a lot like a lot of ours, there's blessings and there's hardships and curses that come along with that. And my family was marked by just some dysfunction. I don't know how else to say it, Joel. Just, patterns of abuse and addiction that I was around, patterns of abuse and addiction that I was the recipient of. And so just a hard upbringing that was marked by pain,
Mm.
and in really strange ways marked by moments of happiness as well. So, it just, my life growing up, it was like a pendulum, and you never knew. It wasn't like a slow and steady switch from addiction or abuse to joy and happiness. Sometimes you'd be going down one and it would just snap back to the other really quick. So it's just always kind of like walking on eggshells, not exactly knowing when the other shoe was going to drop. And growing up in that kind of dysfunction, that pain without Jesus, it doesn't leave a lot of options for how you're going to try to solve that deep kind of ache inside of your heart. And so I did it like anybody would do. I just started to try to find anything that would solve those deep-seated questions. So my brother and I, we had a lot of freedom, and we had a lot of fun, and we had access to different things. And so I was probably, by the time, I grew up angry, for one. I mean,
Sure.
I had a smile on my face, but I could snap too. And that, from elementary on, like I was just the kid who was getting into fights in school and out on the playground. And, just had a lot of pain, And it didn't take very long for you to get around substances. And so probably by the time I was 12 or 13, I was drinking pretty heavily. I think by the time I was 12, me and my buddies, we'd steal a bottle of liquor and just drink it all the way. So I'm not talking about like stealing a beer from your dad's fridge. I mean, like stealing a bottle of hard liquor. And
Oof.
at 12 years old, I have an 11-year-old son now, which is a little alarming. I mean, he's growing up following Jesus, so it's a bit different than my experience, right? But
Right.
that's about the age where I started to really dabble in a lot of this stuff. And it didn't take very long for me to realize at least this stuff makes me numb out. And so I would just drink heavily, and drugs followed shortly after that. And relationships with girls followed shortly after that. And so, from middle school on, I was just a really wild kid, running from the Lord and running to anything that kind of eased the pain.
Yeah.
Just a wild, kind of broken childhood.
Wow. I'm curious. Let's put a pin on that. We got to hear how you began to run towards the Lord and not just away from the Lord. But I'm curious. You're now a pastor. I'm just wondering, the pain, the abuse, the addictions that you experienced, the wild pendulum swings that you talked about, and then your own self-medicating with alcohol. I'm interested, Jeff. How has that shaped you as a pastor now? I mean, how's that shaped your ministry?
In tons of ways, right? So, for one, not growing up in the church, I think that's influenced my preaching. I just want to be incredibly welcoming to anybody inside and outside of the faith. I have zero memories of ever being invited to church growing up. Like, not a single one. And I'm sure I terrified most of the Christians who were around me. I didn't know any Christians around me, but there had to have been Christians around me. I'm sure I terrified them, and they never invited me anywhere. They didn't want me showing up at their youth event or anything like that. And so I'm cognizant of that when I preach. I always want to be preaching to folks who are exploring the faith or maybe invited to our church for the very first time. And then we have Celebrate Recovery at our church. We run a couple ministries all the time. Alpha is one of them. We want to lead people to Jesus. And another one is Celebrate Recovery. And Celebrate Recovery it's just near and dear to my heart, not only because of the family that I came from, because of my own struggles, my own addictions, but I've just seen Celebrate Recovery work and invite people into the presence of God so that he can begin that kingdom work of healing them and setting them free and not making them over-identify with their addiction, but really celebrate the journey of recovery. And so I'm a big fan of that. That's in our church. And man, I'm so grateful for ministers who can excel in spaces like that. And I commonly think back to my years growing up, wondering what would have happened if someone would have just invited me, or if somebody would have just prayed for me, if somebody would have just said, man, I see this in you, but you're just going down the wrong road. And I don't know if I would have responded or not. It's kind of it's just, no, man, we don't really know.
Yeah.
But I don't want to be the kind of pastor who looks at people and just assumes a no.
Yeah, right.
And we're working really hard as a church to be incredibly invitational and to make sure that we never assume any. Everyone's only just one small encounter away from giving their life to the Lord. and living for him in a really dramatic and powerful way. And so just really believe that. And we want that to be in everything that we do.
So good. So good. Listen to you talk, Jeff. I'm reminded, I read John Wimber one time. He was telling his testimony, much like yours, and he was in a smaller town, rural area, and he just said, I never once met a Christian, and somebody challenged him on it. He said, well, if they were a Christian and follower of Jesus, they were incognito. They never told me that they were a Christian. I never saw them. So that reminds me of that.
Like thinking back to my story and saying that, I do remember meeting a few Christians. My family did take me to church on a couple of occasions, but they were horrible memories. Just horrible memories. Like I would never have gone back again if I wasn't forced. I would never wish those stories upon anybody else. Oh, I have one memory. I was in elementary school. And we went to this church. I won't name it because it's unimportant, but we went to this church and my family, they dropped me off at the kids ministry thing. And remember, I'm not following Jesus. This is kind of bizarre to me, a little terrifying. I don't know why I'm getting dropped off in this dungy looking room off the side of the building with some people that I've never met before. And they're handing out slips of paper to everyone who walks in the room. And what I later learned was on each sheet of paper, there was a commandment from the 10 Commandments. And then we went in and sat down, and they gave us large sheets of white paper and colored pencils. And the children's ministry activity of that day was to draw out the 10 Commandments. I've since told our kids pastor, we're never doing this. I don't want to ever hear you about doing this. Well, wouldn't you know that the kid who's like a pagan, I'm so far from God, they give me the slip, thou shalt not commit adultery. And now I'm supposed to draw this. I'm supposed to draw this on a sheet of paper. So I didn't know who Jesus was, but I knew what adultery was. And so I'm looking around, everyone's drawing these pictures and they're just loving it. Like they love church, and I'm a fish out of water. And I look up on the wall, there's a painting of, this white Jesus with beautiful feathery hair. And, and he's got a staff and he's holding a lamb.
Right.
And I thought, man, that is strange. Jesus must like sheep. He must love sheep. So I drew, thou shalt not commit adultery with these two sheep. And I just, with what I said, I thought Jesus likes sheep. So I guess I'll put them in the story, So one sheep is with another sheep, and then it fast forwards in a comic book, and then another sheep walks in and just goes, bah! And man, I turned it in and they kicked me out of there so fast. And I had to go sit in the principal's office or whatever, or the children's pastor's office. And I just sat there for 30 minutes until my parents came and picked me up. And I remember thinking, I don't think I ever want to go back here again.
Right.
I could never do this again and be totally fine.
Wow. I'm so glad you told that story on so many levels. It's hilarious. And as you were setting it up, I thought, he's going to say he got thou shalt not commit adultery. And sure enough, buddy. And I'm so glad you picked sheep.
It's just a fruitless endeavor. That should not be in the kids' ministry curriculum. I don't know who came up with that idea, but...
No. It was a bad Sunday. Well, one of the things I love about your story is so there's these problems of pain. There's these times of pain. There's times of even church pain, and just that being bad. And yet what I love about Jesus is his promise is that he will use all things for the good. He doesn't cause all things. He doesn't want all things to happen, but he will use it for our good. And of course, the next verse says that good is he will predestine us to look more like the image of Christ. In your case, part of the good is he's used it to inform how you minister to people. And as we're going to hear in a little bit, there's been great fruit in that. So I want to back up. So I got ahead of ourselves, but when you were sharing about the pain and then seeing that you're a pastor now, I just wondered how that has informed you. So thank you for sharing that. So before I put a pin in that story, you said you were running far from the Lord. Tell us how in the world did you come to know Jesus?
Well, yeah, like any story, there's just layers there. So remember, my family, we're not following the Lord. We're humanist. We're just living for ourselves. A lot of pain, a lot of dysfunction. And as I've gotten older and dug into my family systems and dug into my history, I've learned more about the generations that preceded me. And I learned that I had a grandma and grandpa who did love the Lord. They just never talked about it. I have no memory of them ever talking about Jesus, which is kind of a bummer. But they did love the Lord. And I think they were watching us and they're like, man, this family, they need help. Man, I mean, they need serious help. And so my grandma one year, I will never forget this. My grandma one year for Christmas, she bought my mom a Bible. And so it's wrapped under the tree. And it's Eugene Peterson's rendition of scripture, right? It's the Message.
Wow.
And my mom opens it and she's like, what is this, a Bible? And she like practically threw it across the room. I mean, it started a family fight. Like, who do you think we are? We need a Bible in our family, da 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 da. And my grandma's probably sitting over there in the corner like, yeah, y'all need Jesus. I mean, like, bad. You need Jesus,
Right.
big time, you know? And so she, out of the kindness of her heart, bought my mom Message Bible. And I don't think she picked that up for months. But in a family system filled with pain, you kind of eventually search for anything. I think we all kind of do. And my mom eventually picked up the Message Bible and just started reading it from page 1 through. And the kindness of God on a family that's not living for him, not searching out for him, to move in that moment. She read it and could not put it down. She could not put it down. And the way she tells the story is that she got to Acts. And when she gets to Acts, she reads this passage of Pentecost where the Spirit of God falls on the early church. And she just put the book down and she said, God, if this is real, I want to feel it right now. I'm tired of playing games. And she said, just bold like that. And she said the Spirit of God just fell on her in her room in such a powerful way. And I am so grateful for the dynamic expression of his love and presence and power, because it saved her. And that was a huge part in the rest of my family getting saved. And, you know, I will say that initially she was the only one who gave her life to Christ. And I thought she went crazy. I like legit thought she went crazy. She was on fire, man. I mean, she went all in with the Lord. She had this Pentecost type of experience while she's in a bedroom by herself. And so then she made it her task to pray us all into the kingdom. And she would not just quietly in her bedroom, like hope to God that we would experience it. She would walk around the house and just pray for us. And I thought she had lost it.
Wow.
I mean, I already knew I was in a funky family, but now it had just gotten weird. And she would walk around and she'd stick her hand out at us and just start praying for us. And then she had this profound experience of the Holy Spirit. She'd pray in tongues sometimes. And I had never heard anything like that before. So I remember one time watching a baseball game with my dad, and she just had this intercessory spirit. She walked into the room and stuck her hand out at me and started praying at me in tongues, you know, just and I remember thinking she needs to get locked up. Like I looked at my dad and I told him out loud in front of my mom, I said, I'm never bringing friends to this house again. I'm never bringing friends over here ever again. And he just kind of looked at me and we just, I don't know, shifted our attention to the game. It was kind of like, don't ask about it.
Right.
Let's just, forget about it. Because I think she has maybe gone a little crazy. I bet my dad thought that too, I mean, but sure enough, one by one, people in my family started having experiences with the Lord. Wow. My dad had an encounter. He had a dream where in this dream, just the spiritual reality became real to him and he gave his life to Christ. My brother had an encounter with the Lord, ended up going on a missions trip to Belize and coming back on fire for God. My younger sister had an encounter with the Lord at a church service and gave her life to Jesus. And it's just me sitting over there living the wild life. I was I was a high functioning kind of addict. So I still was excelling in academics and athletics. I went to college to play football at a small school. So and my life was still together, but very broken, very dysfunctional. I just thought everybody had gone crazy.
Yeah. So as the dominoes are falling and you're the last one standing, you're just thinking, what is up with these folks?
Yeah. What is up with these folks? And I had an easy out. It was my senior year in high school. So I was going to college anyway. So it's like, fine, I'll finally just get out of here, get out of this weirdness and people praying for me all the time. I'm just going to go to college. And my mom told me, when I was leaving, she looked at me. She looked me in the eye and she said, Jeff, I don't care if you think I'm crazy. Because she knew I thought she was crazy. She said, Jeff, I don't care if you think I'm crazy. There's power in the name of Jesus. And I just want you to remember that. Wow. And I was like, whatever, Mom. I packed my car and I went to college. Well, fast forward 9 months, my freshman year of college. And you're just living the same life, playing ball, going to keggers, doing the thing, just being wild. And I decided that I was going to go on a spring break trip with my buddies to Cancun. And so we bought kind of an all-inclusive package with Steve-O from his old famous MTV show, and ended up on stage doing all the spring break MTV stuff you can imagine in Mexico. And I was already living a wild life, but Mexico was wild. It was all the things that you could expect and that parents fear about Cancun spring break trips. That was me. I was that guy. And I just was taking people with me on that journey wherever I could go. And so I did that. And there was one point when I was on that trip, actually, I ended up, we wanted more than just alcohol. So we started asking around about drugs, and I ended up finding myself in a drug lord's house just outside of Cancun, holding a bag of Coke in my hand, about the size of a tennis ball. And it was just like, I'm telling you, it was a moment. Looking back at that moment, I now can see the hand of God all over my life in that space, but I wouldn't have known it then. All I know is that when I stuck out my hand and the drug dealer laid that bag of cocaine in my hand, it felt like little Frodo Baggins holding the ring for the first time. It's just a small thing, but just the weight of it just kind of landed on my hand. And I remember thinking, if I go this far, there might be no coming back.
Right.
And so I looked at the drug dealer and I go, hello, Mr. Drug Dealer, I guess I don't want any cocaine today. And I just gave it back to him and I walked away. And I still did all the other normal Cancun stuff. But I really think that God was beginning to demonstrate his power to me in that moment of rescuing me and saving me. And little did I know that 48 hours later, I was going to have a really profound encounter with the Lord myself back in the United States once I flew home.
Wow.
And so that's really what happened for me. I was saved by probably a grandma who gave a Bible to a mom who had an encounter with the Lord and just started praying for me. Because I don't know how many other people were actually probably praying for me.
Yeah.
And when I flew back from Cancun, I had to have a quick night's rest at my parents' house. And that night I went into my bedroom and I was getting ready for bed. I was sitting on my bed, not laying down yet, but getting ready to go to sleep. And I began to have just a really profound spiritual encounter. And it actually started with the demonic, which I know is a little weird, but there was just a lot of darkness in my life, and I had made a lot of agreements with the demonic, and it started by feeling an actual sensation of oppression and pressure on my chest, and I could hear, like a demonic voice just cursing me out, just every curse word you can imagine, just laying into me, just cursing me out, telling me how worthless I am, and da 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 da. And, it turns out that kids that get kicked out of Sunday school and don't go to church and don't follow Christ, those kids never learn anything about spiritual warfare. So I had no tools in my belt. I had no idea what I was experiencing. I had, visions of like the exorcism of Emily Rose in my mind from watching Hollywood films and things like that. But it wasn't like that. It was just this dark, oppressive sense and cursing voice. And I remember being scared and just freaking out. And not knowing my bearings, not knowing exactly where I was almost. And it wasn't an out-of-body experience, but it almost felt that way because it was so real, but it was so supernatural all at the same time. And in that moment of fear and desperation, that quote that my mom looked me in the eye when she sent me off to college came back to my brain when she said, "I don't care if you think I'm crazy, there's power in the name of Jesus." And so I just sat there on the end of my bed and I just started doing what any young man would do. I started quoting my mom. I said, my mom said there's power in the name of Jesus. My mom said there's power in the name of Jesus. It's no prayer, no spiritual warfare today. This was my spiritual warfare. It was quoting my mom who told me there was power in the name of Jesus. And I don't even know if I believed it, to be honest. I was just desperate for anything that would relieve me from this attack and this oppression. And I cried out, quoting my mom for 6, 7, maybe 8 times. And then on that last moment, that moment of breakthrough, I just fell back to my bed And the only way I can explain it is by likening it to an old cartoon, like an old Bugs Bunny or Elmer Fudd cartoon where air goes in one ear and it goes out the other. I could just hear that demonic voice cursing me in my right ear, transferring to my left, and then just going away.
Wow.
Just gone. And then the Spirit of God fell on my room in such a heavy, intangible way. I wasn't floating, Joel, but it felt like I was.
Wow.
Because I think I had been carrying so much darkness and so much baggage for so long, and I'd been delivered. I mean, I really think I was being delivered in that moment. I felt so alive and so free. And then the Lord, I now have language for this, but in the moment, it just felt like I was watching a movie. I had two visionary experiences flash before me right away. And the first one was me on this dark, windy road, just grabbing as many people as I could, leading them to this giant bonfire where I was bragging about my sinful life and all of the bad things I had done, all the bad things that I could do, like I was sharing, war stories, like I was a hero of sin.
Right.
And then it flashed the life I was currently living. And then it flashed to this next vision with a bright white light at the end, straight and narrow road. And as it got clear, I saw the face of Jesus, and he just said, I want you to lead people to me.
Right.
I want you to lead people to me. And I'm emotional because every time I think back to that, I'm still just so grateful for the love of God.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful that he just showed up to me. I wasn't looking for him. I wasn't trying to pursue him. I was in Cancun trying to live the dumbest life you could ever imagine. And because of his love and his pursuit for me, he showed up to me in a way that I think was probably the only way that I could have been rescued, because I was so far gone. And I'm so grateful. I'm so thankful.
Yeah.
And in that moment, I said, I don't want that other vision. I want this vision. This is what I want. I want to lead people to you. So I feel like it was my moment of salvation. And I think it was a moment where I was called into ministry, kind of all wrapped into one. And I'm just so thankful. I'm so thankful that he rescues us and that he sets us free. And then, the next day, it was a quick turnaround, man. I mean, I had to go to college the next day.
Sure.
So I packed my car and I went to college, and I had been saved 3 days. I'd been saved 3 days. And then I found out there was this thing on my campus called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship.
Oh, yeah.
And InterVarsity Christian Fellowship is a wonderful campus ministry. And I'm so grateful for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. At our particular school, there's a big chapter, like 300-400 students. And so I went to this thing, and it was the strangest thing. It was unlike the little childhood 10 Commandments type of church experience I had. There was a speaker. It was kind of hip and kind of cool. And they had good music, but it was strange. I found it strange that they wanted me to sing their music. I was used to going to concerts where they would sing to me. And so all of it felt really strange, but I sat there in the back row really kindly and nicely and minding my own business. And afterwards, I walked up to the leader. His name was John Heatbrink. He still works for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship to this day, now as a regional leader. And I walk up to John Heatbrink and I said, hey, my name is Jeff. I just had this visionary experience with God, encounter with his power, and he told me he wanted me to lead people to him. And so you got a good thing going here. You've gathered a lot of people. I think I'd like to take it from here. I think I'd like to lead this thing from now on and lead these people to Jesus. Because, I had no reference for humility. I didn't know that the vision meant like a journey of sanctification, and that I didn't even get my life together. I just saw there were a bunch of Christians gathered, and so God told me he wanted me to lead people to him. But I'm so thankful because John Heatbrink, I'm thinking now some 19-year-old kid who's a train wreck and known around campus for being like the guy rallying all the troops to go to the keggers and stuff is now saying that he had visionary experience with God and he wants to lead people to Jesus. I'm thinking, dude, you're not ready for this. I mean, he could have said no 1,000 different ways to me, but what he did was he invited me out for coffee the next day. And then after that, he invited me out for coffee the next week. And the week after that, he taught me how to read the Bible. He taught me how to pray. Next thing you know, I was leading a small group. And next thing you know, I was leading a couple small groups, and then leading a prayer ministry kind of event where we started gathering 50 to 100 kids for prayer meetings. And it was all because he said yes. I mean, I really think like recently read this book, Hero Maker, right? That Christina has
Yeah.
been recommending. And I think back to my days, I had somebody like John Heatbrink say yes to me and give me permission. And I'm so thankful
Yeah.
that he did. So, I mean, looking back at my life, my introduction to Christianity was marked by powerful encounters with the Lord.
Yeah.
And then InterVarsity discipleship and reaching the lost, discipleship and evangelism. And so those are my like sovereign foundations as a follower of Christ. Profound encounters with the Lord, a heart for evangelism, and being discipled one-on-one over long periods of time to see life transformation. And I'm so grateful
Man.
for what God has done.
Man, that's a great story, and I appreciate you sharing that. So encouraging, and I hear several things. I'm hearing you talk. A few thoughts came to mind. I'm thinking of, you said, when you're in, if I'm putting some brackets and handles on your story, I'm thinking of prevenient grace. I think it was Wesley who used that term of just grace when we don't even know we need grace. And in Mexico, at a drug, dealer's house, when that thing could have went, sideways 500 ways, and yet the Lord convicts you. He's pursuing you. You respond, and He gives you grace, not just to respond and say no as a pile of cokes in your hand, but He gives you grace that the drug dealer doesn't suspect anything of you all of a sudden saying no. So that's prevenient grace. I think you're talking about like, I wasn't even pursuing Jesus yet. 48 hours later, he comes to me, and I just think of that old poem. He's the hound of heaven, man. God is always pursuing us. He's always on our trail, and I think it's just us responding and stopping, to be caught by Him. And on that night, you were caught by Him. You stopped long enough, and the power and presence of God came up. And the other thing I heard is just, it's a famous song right now. We're saying, "I speak Jesus," right? And I just heard, Jesus is enough, man. He is enough. It made me reflect on a story in my family. My mom had a horrendous cancer battle and was like in ICU for almost a week, where she was like, they call it ICU psychosis, because she just never really slept. And when she kind of came out of that, and we were able to talk in a more cognitive way, she said, "Man, I just feel so bad because I wanted to pray, but all I could say is Jesus." And I just said, Mom, Jesus is enough. And so when your mom gave you that advice, just speak the name of Jesus. Yeah. And it came. He came, and He delivered you in that moment. Not only delivered you from the demonic, but delivered you into His kingdom and into a relationship with Him. And then the grace to get you into InterVarsity. So many cool things there. And then what I loved when you ended there, that part of your story is, man, it just sounds like Vineyard. Radical power encounter, evangelism, discipleship, equipping the saints. I'm seeing that in your story. And so, we're going to have to fast forward a bit, because I want to get to where you're at today. And so, obviously you do grow. And maybe if you can just quickly kind of fast forward us through, how do you end up in ministry? You're married, you have kids now, that. So we don't have a lot of time there, but fast forward us and just how you progress through those stages of life.
Yeah, I mean, well, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship marked me to pursue that ongoing discipleship. And then another ministry acronym that started with the letter I, the International House of Prayer. Both of these two entities influenced me in my college years, because I went to an IHOP conference where I heard a lot about the power of God. And so both of these things were working together. And, but I was still kind of just an arrogant kid.
Sure.
And truthfully, because of some bad church experiences, and then even in college, some church folks telling me that what I had experienced wasn't real, and just kind of a continuation of some of that stuff. I just and just part of my own personality and temperament. Like, God has kind of made me a little bit of as a spiritual entrepreneur as much as He has a pastor. And so all of these things working together just really felt like we needed to start our own ministry. And there's a whole backlog of story behind that. But I had met Natalie at college. Thank God I met her after I gave my life to Jesus, because she was just an amazing Christian woman who, in her childhood and stuff, went to prayer meetings for fun, and I went to parties for fun. So it's a good thing that we met after I gave my life to Christ. But we just, through a series of events and great mentors in our lives, decided to start our own nonprofit with a handful of people. And at this point, we had graduated and we were living in Kansas City. And Kansas City is like a lot of metropolitan areas. There are pockets of incredible wealth and there are pockets of incredible poverty. And we just really felt like God was saying to us, I want you to serve the most overlooked folks in Kansas City. And we just went on a prophetic word and we started exploring that. Our little small group of folks who wanted to start a nonprofit. And so we did that exact thing at the ripe age of 22 and 23. We started fundraising. We started gathering support. And we didn't even have any stories. We just asked people over a cup of coffee if they would support us to serve the most overlooked people in Kansas City. And by His grace, people gave at least a living wage so that we could launch that ministry. And for whatever reason, we got really connected with a gang in Kansas City called the Bloods. And it's a national gang, but they're in Kansas City. And we got really connected with some brothers from the Bloods, and they introduced us to the whole gang. We ended up buying a house in their neighborhood, and for a decade served that zip code and that community.
Wow.
Our streets were called the Dirty 30s. Those were the block of the 30th to the 39th Street. They were run by the Bloods. And man, we loved that. We loved our time there with those guys and girls. And we just discipled young men and young women who were stuck in a pretty harsh cycle of gang violence.
Wow.
And there's a whole nother podcast with stories about that. But during that time, we knew we needed to belong to a local church. We were doing this ministry and we were leading this nonprofit, but we knew, my wife Natalie and I, we knew we needed to be part of a local church. So literally, like any millennial, I guess, would do in this era, we Googled churches that believe in the gifts of the Spirit. That's exactly what we Googled. Like, I'm not kidding. Churches that believe, because we wanted to be around Spirit-filled people. We wanted to experience God and be filled, because we were pouring our lives out, every single day. And so the Vineyard popped up. Vineyard, it was at that time, it was called Vineyard Overland Park, which is a suburb of Kansas City. It's now named Vineyard Community Church. And so we looked it up and, sorry, go ahead.
For those that don't know, Overland Park, that's a different world than the Dirty 30s.
Oh man, culture shock every day. Culture shock every single day. The zip code where we were living in Kansas City, it was 2% white. And my wife is blonde hair, blue-eyed, light skin. I'm blonde hair, blue-eyed, light skin. And we were living in an area that was 2% white. So it was a culture shock when we moved in. And then every time we went to church, it felt like culture shock too. Because Overland Park's about 98% white. It's probably like the inverse, right?
Yeah.
And demographic, socioeconomically, is just a very, very different experience as well.
Off the charts, yeah.
But man, it felt like home the day we entered. And the lead pastor wasn't there. He was gone. We went there in July. And the lead pastor, Mark Warner was his name, who's just a mentor of mine. And
had so much influence with so many people.
He brought me into the Vineyard. And I'm so grateful for him. God has just been so faithful to send people in my life that would disciple me. Just like John Heatbrink and one of the guys from our nonprofit. The next one up was Mark Warner. But when we went there, he was gone for a few weeks on vacation. But our first week there, I'm not kidding, Joel, I knew right away this is where we were supposed to be. Because in that church, there were, a few hundred people there that day, about 50-50 men and women. And almost every single man in that room was worshiping God with their arms raised. And I remember leaning over to Natalie and saying, there are a lot of men crying out to God here, worshiping him. Not just the frozen chosen sitting in the pews kind of doing their little checkbox duty with Jesus, but they're getting after it. And I remember thinking, I could be part of a church like this. And so we just went back every week. And then eventually we met Mark. And Mark and I had really quick chemistry. we see the world very similarly. We see leadership, we just resonated with each other. And he took me under his wing and was such an encouragement. And, one thing led to another. Eventually, nonprofits started by 22 and 23-year-olds. We're kind of running on zeal and credit card debt. That's kind of what we were running on back in those days.
Right.
And eventually that season came to a close. I had to grab a job in corporate America. I was just a salesman in corporate America for Pella Windows. They make the best doors and windows on earth. You can buy them at a retailer near you.
Still got it.
But hey, come on. And then during that season, though, I kept having conversations with Mark and Natalie, and we both still felt called to ministry. And one thing led to another, and I started going to staff meetings, and Mark started having coffees with me, and he and his wife, Diane, they would take Natalie and I out for lunch after church, and our relationship just grew to the point where I was ready to take a leap of faith back into full-time ministry, and they were ready to take a leap of faith with me. And so Mark invited us onto his staff. And again, I know I've already said it, but it's worth repeating. I'm so grateful for him. He took a risk on me. He took a risk on me and mentored me and taught me not just what it meant to be a spiritual leader or a ministry leader. I had been doing that with the nonprofit we led, but he taught me what it was like to be a pastor, to be a shepherd, to care for God's people, to be grounded in a local church. He taught me how to preach, and that guy can preach too, by the way.
Absolutely.
And he taught me how to preach, and it was intimidating. I think I was 26 or 27 years old. The first time I had to preach to him one-on-one in his office before I would go preach to the church. And I was more nervous about that than I was preaching to the whole church.
Yep.
But I'm so grateful for the time he spent with me and the years that he poured into me. And I look back at those times in Kansas City very, very fondly. It's where we raised our family. We had 3 kids. They're 11, 9, and 7 now. But we had all our babies in Kansas City, and we grew up in that church as a family under Mark's leadership. And I'm grateful for that.
This summer, Vineyard USA is hosting our national conference, Seed and Soil, in 2 locations, Denver, Colorado on June 17th through 20th, and Cincinnati, Ohio on July 15th through 18th. We hope that by offering 2 locations and dates, everyone, pastors, leaders, volunteers, even those just curious about the Vineyard, everyone will be able to find a time to join us. The conference will have specific programming for adults, youth, and kids, while we focus on cultivating healthy soil in our hearts and planting seeds for the future for all that God wants to do in us and in the Vineyard. Registration is now open with early bird pricing, so make sure to check out vineyardusa.org to learn more and register today.
To hear you talk about leap of faith, I mean, your beginning story is a leap of faith to saying yes to Jesus, and the deliverance story and the power encounter, and then even a leap of faith to I mean, part of it's just, 18, 20-year-old cockiness, but going up to the university guy and say, man, I'm here, I was called to change the world, and lead people to Jesus. But it's a leap of, you're putting yourself out there for another person to mentor and disciple you. And then a leap of faith to start a nonprofit, and then a leap of faith to say yes to ministry. And then that goes very well for you in Kansas City, I know, in Overland Park. And Mark speaks very highly of you, and others around there do. But there was another leap of faith that was around the corner, and that's the call to go to Fort Collins, Colorado. That wasn't something you were looking for, and yet it came towards you, and you said yes to that call to another great leader in the Vineyard, also Rick Olmsted, who was there when you went there. And so you ended up there. And how long have you been there as you went there? How long have you been in Fort Collins now?
We've been in Fort Collins for about just over 6 years, and I was on Rick's staff for a little while, and then with the intention of creating a transition because he was the founding pastor of Vineyard Church of the Rockies, and that transition went really, really well, really, really smooth. A lot of that credit goes to Rick. He did such a great job of creating a runway for me to grow in relational and spiritual authority in our church. and have been, I was on his staff for about a year and a half before then assuming the position of lead pastor, senior pastor of the church. And I had 9 months kind of under my belt before COVID hit. So it was really perfect timing.
Yeah.
Perfect timing. But it was, we weren't necessarily looking to come out to Fort Collins. Actually, we loved Kansas City and we sure loved that church. But we were just praying, God, do you want us to be here forever? Do you want us to be here forever? And I had a really profound moment with the Lord. I had a dream. Now, not every dream is from God, right? Clearly we could go back and forth and share dreams that were not from God, but God does speak to his people through dreams. And in the dream, I walked up to Mark, who is the pastor of Vineyard Community Church in Overland Park. And I said, Mark, I'm sorry, but I have to resign. I'm moving to Fort Collins to work for Rick Olmsted. And then I woke up. And I had the prophetic etiquette, the pastoral kind of qualification. This is symbolic. It's not literal. And I was talking myself out of it, but I couldn't shake it. I eventually got Rico's number and I gave him a call and I told him the dream. And I said, I think you're supposed to just pray for me. I think you're supposed to be the guy that prays for me during this discernment era. And he starts almost crying on the other side of the phone. And he says, I've been crying out to God, asking him to call someone to come and take my job for the last week. And maybe your dream is an answer to both of our prayers.
Wow.
But in order to do this, we need to do it the right way. So I need you to go talk to Mark and you need to have a conversation with him about pursuing a relationship with me and what it would look like to transition out to Fort Collins. And so we did that. We did it the right way. I look back at our transition and Rick did a really, really great job. But I think one thing that we commonly forget about pastoral transitions is there's actually 3 lead pastors that are impacted. There's the receiving lead pastor. In my story, that's Rick O. There's the upcoming lead pastor, that's me. And when 2 lead pastors are in the room, leaders want to lead, right? And so you have a dance of submitting to one another and in humility and respect, loving each other in that journey and that process. But you also have a sending pastor. Yeah. And Mark sent me to Fort Collins, and Mark was training and discipling, not just me, but other leaders. And when you do that, God spreads people around sometimes.
Yeah.
And I have to believe that what you reap, you're going to sow. And Mark is, I know, going to be receiving other leaders that he'll be able to train and raise up. And same with Rick and same with me. And this is how the kingdom grows and expands. And so, yeah, there's always multiple pastors involved in these transitions. And so I'm looking ahead, I'm looking behind, and kind of everything in between.
I love the honor and respect that you showed Mark in there, and the honor and respect that Rick, asked of you to share with Mark. It's so important in these stories, and so good. So you end up in Fort Collins. You're there, and you get 9 months under your belt before a pandemic hits and the world changes. And you navigate all the things that everybody else had to navigate through that. But now your church post-COVID, you're navigating some pretty cool stuff right now. You've come out of a transition, and even great transitions, good transitions, there's still ups and downs. It's especially from a founding pastor. So you've navigated all those things well. You've navigated a pandemic. And now you've turned the corner and you're beginning to see some real fruit. You're beginning to see salvations. You're beginning to see, I would say, even the beginning of your testimony of the things you came out of it in your family, and then your own first ministry, the nonprofit in Dirty 30s, that you're beginning to see those encounters with pain and suffering that you had then emerge as a ministry in your church. So why don't you just tell us a few stories of what's happening? I'd love to hear about some of those salvations and what the Lord is doing and bringing people to Christ through Fort Collins.
I love the miracle of salvation. I really do. I'm captivated. I love praying for the sick. I love giving a prophetic word, a well-timed prophetic word. I love the miracle of salvation. Every chance we get to call someone to Christ and experience that life-transforming decision, it takes me back to my moment. It reminds me of other moments I've been a part of. It encourages me about all the folks. I love the miracle of salvation. And I will say it's been a little bit of a journey, because it's really the last 15 months, Joel. The first couple of years of me being a lead pastor, I was stressed, man. No one can prepare you to be a lead pastor. Yep. I got an eye twitch for 6 months just from the stress and anxiety. Thank God I was working on my emotional health because I wasn't aware of the spiritual weight that's just, you can't always know those things until you're there. And so even if you're not a lead pastor, pray for your lead pastor because there are things that he or she is just experiencing that's hard to quantify.
Yeah. The weight of the first chair, nobody realizes. Until you sit in it, you don't understand it. So, yeah.
And so I got tired and I got focused on trying to manage the transition and following the founder and stuff. All those things are true. And then COVID hit. I think I just got into kind of maintenance mode, which is not my natural temperament. I'm a spiritual entrepreneur as much as anything. And I love starting new ministries and reaching new people. And I always thought I was going to be a church planner because of that. And now I found myself in a church transition. And I kind of just lost a little bit of that DNA that God had given me. And then actually listening to this podcast, the We Are Vineyard podcast, is really where God started to convict me. There was a podcast, you might remember, it was Jay interviewing Rich Nathan, talking about calling people to Christ every time you get a chance. And I remember listening to that podcast, crying and repenting and feeling convicted all at the same time, thinking, God, how have I forgotten to do this? And just, it really was. It was a moment of prayer and conviction and repentance all at the same time. And I had just gotten back from a trip to visit our church plant in Zimbabwe through our friends at Convoy of Hope. And I got to preach there. And Joel, I'm not kidding. I got to preach my story. That's what they wanted me to do, is share your testimony. And at the end of it, I didn't give a call to Christ. And I sat down in the front row, and the lead pastor of that Zimbabwean church stood up and he said, I just have a sense that some of you hearing Jeff's story, you want the same story. And if you want that, you could give your life to Christ, right? It was that simple. And hands went up all over the place. And I just sat there in shame thinking, how have I not called people to Jesus? I listened to the podcast shortly after that. And I met with our preaching team and I said, guys, I don't care how we do it. We're calling people to Jesus every single Sunday. Listen to this podcast. Listen to this other podcast that I found. Here's how I'm going to do it. And I want us to call people to Christ every single Sunday. So I think it was November 2022. November 2022 is when we made the decision. So to date this podcast, it's like 14 or 15 months since that point. We've led over 156 first-time decisions for Jesus Christ on a Sunday morning, just by drawing the line in the sand and saying, do you want to give your life to Jesus Christ today? If you do, then raise your hand right where you're sitting.
Wow.
And people have responded. And it's God's grace. It is just God, just like my story. And this is what gave me so much confidence. I was not looking for God. In fact, I was running in the opposite direction, but he's after us. His love and his presence is after us. He wants to rescue his children. Absolutely. And if we really believe that the Father is always at work and no one can come to the Lord unless the Father draws them, then all we need to do is we need to be faithful and take out that leap of faith to just draw that line in the sand and invite people to respond. Like I had never been told growing up that a decision for Jesus was actually important. And there are people in our churches all across the nation that just don't know that actually making a personal decision, that believing in their own hearts and confessing that he is Lord, that's actually like an important step. Yep. And there's going to be 1,000 steps after that. Of course there is. But that first one is important.
Right.
And so we have just been calling people to Christ ever since that podcast just blasted my heart.
Wow.
And I am so, so grateful that we've done that. Because there are 150 to 160 eternal stories that we've gotten to be a part of.
Yeah.
By making that simple change on a Sunday morning.
Well, a couple things. One is I'll Venmo you after this recording for plugging We Are Vineyard, so I'll send you something.
If Keller Windows wants to Venmo me too, they can do that. They might have a bigger marketing budget.
Well, we might have them Venmo us for broadcasting it out. Okay. But seriously, thanks for saying, because these podcasts I think are rich and so good. And then I would say, I heard Rich, he did that at one of my area meetings because I pastored in the area he was in. He did that 15, 20 years ago. ago, and that convicted me. And so that's always been a regular part of my preaching ever since. And I have shared this story of how to do evangelism in your church, and I'll just talk about the low-hanging fruit of doing what you were doing since November 22. And I'll have pastors, and they'll say, but I mean, I've literally had pastors say, I got 15 people. I have 25 people. And a couple of them I've challenged, or all of them I've challenged, but I can think of two right off the top of my head where I've told them specifically, I said, listen, who knows? Maybe they're all saved, but you don't know. And then the other thing is what you're also doing is you're setting up expectation that if you bring your friend into this meeting, they will hear the gospel and have a chance to follow Jesus. And third, depending how you do it, most people I know, and I've listened to one of your sermons and heard you do the thing, you're doing a short gospel presentation. It's not just raise your hand right now. You're actually doing the gospel in there. Well, if all 25 people at a small church are saved, what they're hearing is a tool. What they're hearing is the way to lead others to Jesus. They're getting a gospel presentation, and then they go, oh, I could do that conversationally with people. So both the pastors I'm thinking in my head, one had a 15-member church, the other one 25, they said, they came back. One was like 9 months later and said, Joel, I got convicted. I've been doing it every week. And it's starting to happen. People are starting to invite their friends because they're a little sheepish sharing their faith, but they know every Sunday their friend will hear the gospel because I'm going to share it. So
no, I mean, it's the primary reason is because we want people to actually make eternal decisions to follow Jesus. Absolutely. But the secondary and tertiary reasons, right, it influences culture and it trains and disciples you. You're exactly right. And so like right now in our church on a Sunday morning, towards the beginning of the sermon, I usually tell people, hey, if you've never given your life to Christ, I'm going to give you a chance to do that today.
Yep.
And then I go about preaching, just weaving it in and out. I might remind them once or twice. Again, a short gospel message there at the end. And then I invite people. And now, culturally, the faith in the room is growing. You can watch people's faces that we're all anticipating how many people are going to respond today. Because it's only been over 52 weeks in a year. So it's been about 65 weeks or something like that. That's how long we've been doing it. And that means we're batting for about 2.5 people a week on average.
Yeah.
So it's multiple hands. And there's some weeks where no one raises their hand. And it's awkward. But the awkwardness is worth it for the times where 5, 6, 7 people give their life to the Lord. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, Joel, we had an entire family, mother, father, and 2 kids. They all gave their life to Christ. Every single one of them. And one hand went up and then bam, 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 bam. It was a chain reaction. It was the real Acts type of story. They and their household got saved. I mean, it was a beautiful moment. So the anticipation of what could happen is taking place in our church. And then the discipleship moment, exactly what you said. They're learning how to articulate the gospel. And here's the other thing. I've told our folks at leaders meetings, hey, if you're not very comfortable sharing the gospel yet, you can still be an inviter. And if you bring them here, I'll share the gospel and we'll work together as a team. And of course, the goal is that everybody in our church will know how to confidently share the gospel. But we're all on different parts of our journeys. And if you're not fully comfortable sharing it yet, you could still be an inviter. If you fill the chairs, we'll preach the gospel and we'll celebrate on earth and in heaven together.
Yeah, listening to you, it is no accident of the joy you have right now, even as you're sharing it. It is, and from the stories I've heard of what's happening at the Vineyard of the Rockies all around, the joy factor in your church is up. Because if you think about it, anytime a baby is born, families have joy. You know what I'm saying? Like you can have the stuffiest, non-emotive person and you bring a baby in the room, man, and they go crazy. Their voice changes. They say, "Oh, go." They just do all this stuff. And you're like, what happened to them? I've never seen them like that. Babies bring joy. Well, I'm telling you, when there's a born again experience and people are birthed into the kingdom, it brings joy to a church. And so that's another reason to preach the gospel and to lead people, because it brings.
Now when people raise their hand in our church, people cheer.
Yeah.
People cheer. And at first I thought, man, this is awkward. Are we like disclosing too much? Because I don't do like the close your eyes and bow your heads. And I just, if you're giving your life right here, something happens in your heart when you go public with an internal decision. So just raise your hand right where you're at. And people cheer. And then the baptisms, Joel. I mean, the baptisms have been amazing. If you're going to start doing this and start calling people to Jesus, which I think everyone should do every Sunday, if I could just wave a magic wand and everybody just started doing that every Sunday, I would be so thrilled. But you've got to be ready. There's a cost to it. One, some people did get a little cranky with me and they told me they didn't want to be a part of a church that was, so evangelistic or whatever. And I don't know, you just gotta keep casting the net and let those people go. I don't know what church they're kind of looking for, but I'm in the business of helping people find Jesus for the first or 10,000th time. But it also changed baptisms. Now, the last time we had a baptism, we do them more frequently now because people are giving their life to Christ. It was beautiful. It was husband and wife, or, my son is so one of my favorite stories is there was a kid hanging around our house because he's best friends with my son. My son invited him to church. He started coming to church with us and going home and telling his family how much he loved our church. And so then they came to church, and once they all ended up raising their hand. They all ended up getting saved. There's a family of 5, 3 boys, mom and dad, and they made their own T-shirts for our baptism. And they all showed up and they all got baptized, one after another, after another, after another, after another. It was a beautiful moment. But I think that baptism, we had 4 entire families all get baptized together.
Wow.
And then in this moment of celebration, I gave another call.
Yeah.
I gave another call and I said, hey, look, you might still be on the sidelines, but if you want to be part of the family of God, I've already shared, you can give your life to Christ now and come and get baptized today, even if you weren't planning on it. And Joel, the next thing that happened was this dude kind of been hanging around our church every now and then, but never like a faithful attender.
Sure.
Walked straight up to me. He grabbed me and held me close and whispered into my ear, and he said, I'm ready to go all in with Jesus today. I said, you can get baptized right now. And you know what he did, Joel? I'll never forget. I've got pictures. They're just not on our Facebook or social media as a church. He ripped his shirt off and jumped in the tub, shirtless. Shirtless man just jumped in the tub. My girls, we bring all the kids in for baptisms. My girls are front and center. And my daughter's eyes, they just got as big as saucers. Like, what is he doing? I mean, he's a big guy, too. He was like 280-pound guy. So when he got in the tub, there was water displacement. He got in. No, she just whipped it off. He was just so happy to give his life to Jesus, to enter into the family of God. He wanted to get baptized that very moment. And of course we baptized him.
Sure.
And everybody went wild. It was a beautiful, beautiful moment.
Oh, man. Man, it's so cool. And so cool that you're responsive to the Spirit in that moment to pay attention to that nudge and give the call again. And because a guy's in the kingdom because of that. I love the threads through your story. And as we, kind of come to a conclusion here I want you to share about one more thing. And there's this thread of grace. There's this thread of power encounter. There's this thread of evangelism and discipleship. There's this thread as you begin a nonprofit in Kansas City for the people that are the most unreached folks, or the folks that need the most help in the city. All of these things, it's like God's been working that into your life before you were a Christian, after you're following Jesus, in your first leadership moments, in your Kansas City Overland Park ministry there at the Vineyard, then in Fort Collins. Now you're beginning to see the salvations. And you're in the beginning stages of a really cool ministry to the poor and to those that often get left behind in big cities like Fort Collins. Tell us a little bit about what's happening right now.
Yeah, well, in the middle of COVID, back up a couple of years, in the middle of COVID, there was a building that was about to go on sale. And actually, it was a little before that. They gave us a tour of this building. They asked us, it's right in our church's backyard. I mean, it's adjacent to our property. They asked us if we would be interested in purchasing this building. And I said, no, I'm not interested in buying this building. But I tell you what, if you donate the building to our church, I commit to you that we'll renovate it and we'll use it to serve the poor in our community. And they all kind of laughed. I mean, this is like a professional commercial real estate agent, they came here to see if we would buy the building. I'm asking them to donate it. And I just it was just the only way I can explain it is the gifts of the Spirit, right? In 1 Corinthians, this was a moment of the gift of faith. It was a moment of the gift of faith. I looked at the commercial real estate agent and I said, no, for real. I'm asking you to donate the building. And if you do, we'll renovate it and we'll use it to serve the most under-resourced and the poor in our community. We'll make you guys famous for donating this building to us. And I'm thinking to myself, we're going to glorify God and we're going to lead all kinds of people to Jesus and care for their basic needs, right? But they laughed, and 6 months later, they offered us the building at 25% off, and I repeated the same story. Just donate it. If you donate it, we'll use it to serve the poor. In the middle of COVID, they offered us the building for half off. And that's a pretty steep price. I mean, it's $1 million asset. Like, maybe I should have called the board and said, hey, I don't know, half off. Like, what do you guys think? But what I said was, guys, I really think you should donate the building. If you do, we'll renovate it to use it to serve the poor. And fast forward to where we're at now, as at the recording of this podcast just last night, we got all of our leaders together and we kicked off a giving campaign so that we could raise $3 million in 2 years so that we could serve 1,500 people a month in this space, in a space that we're going to call the Love Foco Resource Center. And we're creating this collaboration of nonprofits that are all going to get a piece of the pie under the umbrella of Vineyard Church of the Rockies, where they can expand their ministries in our city, unite the strengths of these organizations together to maximize our reach for the folks who are the most overlooked and under-resourced in our community, to glorify God and to bring people closer to Jesus. And I couldn't be any more excited about this because I know what's going to happen. Jesus is going to be made famous in our city. People are going to be invited into the life of our local church or any local church if we're not the best fit for them. And people are going to enter into the kingdom and be discipled over the long haul on what it means to thrive this side of heaven and in preparation for eternal glory as well. And I am so thrilled for this. And it's just kind of funny how God works all these pieces together. But a few years ago, I did a sermon series called Love Foco. Foco is short for Fort Collins. And we did a small sermon series called Love Foco, based out of Jeremiah 29:7, where we're praying for the city where God has sent us, because its welfare will determine our welfare. And so to kick that series off, we brought the mayor in on a Sunday and the city manager, and I did an interview with them. And I just asked them, what is one of the best ways the faith community and a Christ-centered church could serve the city that we've all come to love? And they shared 3 or 4 different things, but a lot of it was about being a friend to the overlooked folks of our community, under-resourced folks in our community. And so in that moment, after that interview, I just told the church, I said, church, I want you to start praying with me for that building, because I think God's going to donate that building to us. And, I think the same thing happened in church that day that happened when I first said it to that commercial real estate agent. There's a spattering of chuckles and disbelief, right. But there were some intercessors and some prayer warriors that started joining me in prayer. And man, we prayed and prayed and prayed. And sure enough, it's now a reality. And our church I feel spoiled, Joel. We have 3 buildings in a triangle campus with a green space and playground right in between. And now we're kicking off this giving campaign to make sure that we can renovate this space and serve the poor in our community. And I'm just going to be totally transparent. When we moved from Kansas City to Fort Collins, it was hard. It was hard because we loved Kansas City and we loved our neighbors and we loved those men and women that we were living life with, and they were teaching us so much. We thought we started a ministry in Kansas City so that we could help people. What we realized is that we needed a lot of help. And it was our neighbors in the inner city that were going to teach us all about all kinds of things like systemic injustice and racism and just all kinds of things like generational poverty and what that actually looks like. I mean, I wasn't exposed to any of that growing up in small town Iowa. So that was like seminary or master's degree for me. And I'm so thankful for that time. But when we moved to Fort Collins, there was a sense of grieving, right? Because we did miss that ministry. And God is just so kind. He is just so good, because now, like you said, that thread that he's weaved in and out of my life and my heart and my ministry, it's coming again. And I'm so excited that in our church, we still are seeking powerful encounters with the Lord, leading people to Jesus in first-time decisions, discipling them. And now we get to minister to the poor as a church community. And it is a privilege and an honor to do this, isn't it?
Oh, it is.
Oh, we can just never forget that. It's just such a privilege and an honor to do this.
Wow. remind me again, and in case people missed it, how much did the building end up costing you?
$0. $0. In fact, at closing, because they were misguided, they thought that we have to pay property taxes. At closing, they brought a check for the property taxes for that year. So
Right.
we got the keys to the building and a check. It was incredible. It was
Wow.
incredible. Now it needs some work, right?
Sure.
And what I've learned is renovations, when you have to work with the city and you have to get things up to code, like
Sure.
there's some rocks that have to be overturned and you have to look at what's under them, and some of those are not cheap. But that's why we're raising our money. When you start at zero, it's pretty easy to launch a giving campaign. So it's God. I was talking with Brian McLeese, who's a member of our
Yeah.
church and a dear friend of many in the Vineyard. And he said, Jeff, the sweet thing about our story is that all we're doing is we're following the miracles.
Yep.
That's all we're doing. We're following the miracles.
Yeah.
And so now we're just asking for a few million more miracles. And I'm trusting that God is going to provide.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that story and all the stories today. I mean, you said just a few moments ago about the thread through your life. And the sense I had, even listening to you, Jeff, is that's not over with this building and this campaign and the potential to in the coming years to serve 1,500 people a month. The sense I had is this is a thread you're going to see over and over and over in the life of your ministry, through the church that you're at, but also in your personal life. That this constant thread of encounters with Jesus, leading others to Jesus, discipling them, ministering to the underserved and the poor, and then just doing that over and over and over again. That's a thread you're going to see through your whole life, brother. Sense that. So
Let it
be
be.
encouraged.
Let it be.
Well, thank you again. I know we didn't even get to, we got to some incredible stories of your life. You got more. There's a whole, inner city, Kansas City world we could explore. There's a whole deep dive, and I've heard you and Rick do it on pastoral succession and how to do that well. So I look forward to hearing more stories in the future. But thank you so much. I know our listeners have enjoyed listening to this today. So thank you.
Well, it's an honor to be here, and it's great spending time with you, Joel.
Thank you, man. Look forward to seeing you again in person and not just over a podcast and Zoom. So
That's right. That's right.
As we celebrate our 50-year anniversary in the Vineyard, if you're interested in learning more about Vineyard history, there are plenty of resources for you. Check out our show notes for links to books, YouTube videos, and more to learn about Vineyard history and identity. And make sure to keep listening to the podcast this year for stories of Vineyard churches throughout the year.